In 2014, a militant group calling itself the Islamic State released a propaganda video that shook the world. In it, a bulldozer rolls across a sand berm in the flat, blistering desert between Iraq and Syria. As the machine grinds through the earth, erasing the border post that separated two nations, a narrator speaks directly into the camera. He says, "This is not the first border we will break." And then the video cuts to a title card. It reads, "The End of Sykes-Picot." Now, regardless of what you think about that group and their horrific campaign of violence, they understood something that most people in the West have never been taught. They understood that the borders of the modern Middle East were not drawn by the people who live there. They were drawn by two European diplomats in secret during a war on a map with a pencil. And those lines, scrolled almost casually across the Arabian desert, the mountains of Kurdistan, and the river valleys of Mesopotamia, became the fault lines of virtually every major conflict the region has suffered for over a century. This is the story of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. It is the story of how two men, one British and one French, sat in a room in 1916 and carved up an empire that had governed the Middle East for 400 years. They did it without consulting a single Arab, a single Kurd, a single Druze, a single Assyrian, or anyone else who actually lived there. And the consequences of what they did are still bleeding into headlines today. To understand why two mid-level diplomats ended up redrawing the map of the known world, you have to understand what was happening in 1915. The First World War was raging across Europe. Millions of young men were dying in the trenches of France and Belgium in a stalemate that seemed to have no end. But the war was not confined to Europe. The Ottoman Empire, which had ruled over the Arab world, much of North Africa, and large parts of southeastern Europe for centuries, had entered the war on the side of Germany and the Central Powers in November of 1914. This was a seismic event. The Ottoman Empire was enormous. At its height, it had stretched from the gates of Vienna to the coast of Yemen, from Algeria to the Persian Gulf. By 1914, it was weakened. Yes, the Europeans had been calling it the sick man of Europe for decades, but it was still vast, still dangerous, and its entry into the war opened up new fronts that stretched British and French resources to breaking point. Britain, in particular, had deep strategic anxieties. The Suez Canal, which connected the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and onward to India, ran through Ottoman-controlled Egypt. India was Britain's most valuable colonial possession, the jewel in the crown, and any threat to the route connecting London to Delhi was treated as an existential crisis. If the Ottomans could cut that lifeline, Britain's entire imperial architecture would be in jeopardy. So, while the trenches of France consumed the headlines, the real chess match, the one that would reshape the world for a century, was being played out across the deserts, mountains, and river systems of the Middle East. And every major European power wanted a piece of the Ottoman carcass before it had even finished dying. The French had their own obsessions. For centuries, France had cultivated deep ties with the Christian communities of the Levant, particularly the Maronite Christians of modern-day Lebanon. French missionaries, educators, and merchants had built an extensive network of influence in the coastal cities of Beirut, Sidon, and Tripoli. France considered itself the protector of these communities, and by extension, it considered the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline as its natural sphere of influence. When the war began, French strategists immediately began planning for a post-Ottoman future in which France would control what they called an integral Syria, a vast territory stretching from the Turkish border in the north all the way down to the Sinai Peninsula in the south, and from the Mediterranean coast deep into the interior, including the ancient cities of Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, and Hama. They also had their eyes on Mosul in what is now northern Iraq, because even in 1915s, rumors of massive oil deposits in Mesopotamia were circulating through the corridors of power. Russia, too, had its ambitions. The Tsar wanted Constantinople, the ancient capital of the Byzantine Empire, and control of the Turkish Straits, the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, which would give the Russian Navy access to the warm waters of the Mediterranean for the first time. In March of 1915, Britain and France had already secretly agreed to give Constantinople to Russia in exchange for Russia supporting their own claims elsewhere in the Ottoman territories. This was the Constantinople Agreement, and it was the first of several secret wartime deals that would collectively seal the fate of the Middle East. Italy too was promised its share of the spoils, specifically parts of southern Anatolia, in exchange for entering the war on the Allied side. So, by the middle of 1915, the great powers of Europe were not just fighting a war. They were conducting a colossal real estate negotiation over the body of a dying empire, and every single deal was being made in secret. Но то, что случилось на самом деле, знали только несколько человек. На сцену выходили двое мужчин, которые втайне от всех решили полностью переписать историю целого региона. The first was Sir Mark Sykes. Sykes was a British aristocrat, the 6th Baronet of Sledmere, born in 1879 into a wealthy Yorkshire family. His childhood was, by most accounts, unusual. His parents were deeply unhappy. His father was a reclusive, eccentric landowner who had married a woman 30 years his junior, and the marriage quickly disintegrated. Young Mark was left largely to his own devices, and he developed a restless, imaginative temperament that would define his career. Most winters, his father took him to the Middle East, particularly to the lands of the Ottoman Empire, and these childhood journeys left a deep impression on the boy. By the time he was in his 20s, Sykes had published several books about his travels, including one called Dar-ul Islam, meaning the home of Islam, which detailed his observations across 10 provinces of Ottoman Turkey. He wrote about Kurdish tribesmen and Arab Bedouin, about crumbling mosques and ancient trade routes, about the ethnic diversity and administrative chaos of the Ottoman system. He fancied himself an expert on the region, and to some extent he was. He knew more about the Middle East than most British politicians, but there was a critical gap in his expertise. He never learned to speak Arabic or Turkish with any real fluency. His knowledge was broad but shallow, t.e. Lawrence, the legendary Lawrence of Arabia, who knew Sykes and worked alongside him at various points, was withering in his assessment. Lawrence called Sykes the imaginative advocate of unconvincing world movements, a bundle of prejudices, intuitions, and half-sciences. He said Sykes would sketch out a new world in a few dashes, all out of scale, but vivid as a vision of some sides of the thing we hoped. A good fellow, Lawrence concluded, but a sadly unreliable intellect. Sykes served in the Boer War, became a conservative member of parliament for Hull in 1911, and quickly positioned himself as Westminster's go-to voice on Ottoman affairs. When the First World War broke out, Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, pulled Sykes out of his reserve battalion and into the War Office, where his knowledge of the Middle East was considered invaluable. By December of 1915, Sykes had traveled through Syria, met with T.E. Lawrence in Cairo, and returned to London to brief the War Council. He arrived at Downing Street with a map and a 3-page document outlining his vision for the post-Ottoman Middle East. And it was at this point that he was given the task that would define his legacy and haunt the Middle East forever. He was told to negotiate with the French. The man waiting for him on the other side of the table was François-Georges Picot. Picot was a very different creature from Sykes. Born in 1870 in Paris, the son of a prominent historian, Picot was a career diplomat, trained as a lawyer, and steeped in the traditions of French colonial ambition. He had served in Copenhagen and Beijing before being posted to Beirut as France's consul general shortly before the war. In Beirut, Picot cultivated deep relationships with the Maronite Christian leadership, became a fierce advocate for French control over the Levant. He was a member of the French colonial party, the Parti Colonial, a powerful lobbying group that pushed for the expansion of France's overseas empire. Picot was not a man of compromise. He arrived at the negotiations with a maximalist position. He wanted an integral Syria for France, a territory stretching from Alexandretta in the north to the Sinai in the south, from the Mediterranean to the Iraqi border, including Mosul and its oil. Where Sykes was imaginative and prone to grand gestures, Picot was precise, legalistic, and utterly determined to secure every square mile he could for France. There is one other detail about Picot that is often overlooked, but it matters enormously. During his time in Beirut, Picot had compiled intelligence on Arab nationalist activists in Syria. When the Ottoman authorities launched a crackdown on Arab nationalists in 916, executing 21 prominent citizens of Damascus and Beirut by public hanging, it was widely believed that Picot's intelligence had contributed to the identification of those men. King Faisal of Iraq would later regard Picot as a war criminal. To the Arab world, Picot was not merely a diplomat who drew unfavorable lines on a map. He was a man who had blood on his hands. The negotiations between Sykes and Picot began on the 23rd of November 1915 in London. They were conducted in total secrecy. No Arab leaders were consulted. No Kurdish representatives were invited. No one from the territories being divided had any voice whatsoever. The talks continued through December and into January of 1916, with Sykes and Picot meeting repeatedly to hash out the details of who would get what. The fundamental question was simple, even if the answer was not. When the Ottoman Empire fell, and by 1915 most strategists assumed it would, how would Britain and France divide its Arab provinces between them? By the 3rd of January 1916, the two men had initialed a memorandum of understanding. It was formally ratified by their respective governments in May of that year, and Russia gave its assent in exchange for its own territorial promises in Armenia and Constantinople. Рассекреченные документы показывают, как именно эти два человека, вооружившись карандашом, разделили карту Ближнего Востока на 5 цветных зон, проигнорировав миллионы людей, живших там веками. И это тайное соглашение было лишь началом колоссального обмана. The agreement divided the Ottoman Arab territories into 5 zones, each color-coded on the map. The blue zone, along the Mediterranean coast of Syria and Lebanon, including the cities of Beirut and Tripoli, and extending northward into Cilicia, would be under direct French control. The red zone, covering southern Mesopotamia, the area around Basra and Baghdad, stretching toward the Persian Gulf, would be under direct British control. Zone A, the interior of Syria, including the cities of Damascus, Aleppo, Homs, Hama, and extending to Mosul in northern Iraq, would nominally be an Arab state or confederation, but under French influence and protection. Zone B, covering what would become Transjordan and parts of northern Arabia, would be another nominally independent Arab area, but under British influence. And then there was Palestine, the so-called Brown Zone. Palestine was considered too sensitive, too holy, too contested to be given outright to either power. It was designated for some form of international administration, the details of which were left deliberately vague. No one could agree on what to do with the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, so they essentially punted the question. It was a decision, or rather a non-decision, that would have catastrophic consequences. Now, what is most striking about the Sykes-Picot map is not just what it included, but what it ignored. The lines drawn by these two men paid no attention to the ethnic, religious, tribal, or linguistic realities on the ground. The Kurdish population, which numbered in the millions and occupied a vast mountainous territory stretching across what is now southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, northeastern Syria, and western Iran, was simply split. No Kurdish state was contemplated, no Kurdish voice was heard. 40 million Kurds, one of the largest stateless populations in the world today, trace the origins of their predicament directly to the lines drawn in that room, the Druze. A distinct religious and ethnic community, concentrated in the mountains of southern Syria and Lebanon, found themselves divided between French zones. The Alawites, a heterodox Muslim sect living along the Syrian coast, were lumped together with the Sunni majority of the Syrian interior, populations that had little in common and deep historical suspicions of one another. In Iraq, the agreement combined the Shia majority south, the Sunni-dominated center, and the Kurdish north into a single administrative unit, creating a state that would require authoritarian force to hold together and would eventually produce Saddam Hussein, the Iran-Iraq War, the Gulf War, the American invasion, sectarian civil war, and the rise of the Islamic State. These were not unfortunate accidents. They were structural consequences of borders drawn by men who either did not understand or did not care about the people who lived within them. But here is where the story takes its most cynical turn. At the very same time that Sykes and Picot were secretly carving up the Middle East between Britain and France, the British government was making entirely contradictory promises to the Arabs. Between July of 1915 and March of 1916, Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt, was exchanging a series of 10 letters with Sharif Hussein bin Ali of Mecca. Hussein was the guardian of Islam's holiest city, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad through the Hashemite line, and a man of considerable political ambition. The Ottoman government had appointed him as the Emir of Mecca, but the relationship had soured. The Young Turk Revolution of 1908 had brought a new, aggressively centralizing government to power in Istanbul, one that sought to Turkify the empire and strip Arab leaders of their traditional autonomy. Hussein had been watching the situation deteriorate for years, and when the war broke out, he saw an opportunity through the McMahon-Hussein correspondence, as it became known. Britain effectively promised Hussein that if he launched a revolt against the Ottomans, Britain would recognize and support an independent Arab state, covering the vast majority of the Arab-speaking provinces of the Ottoman Empire. The boundaries were deliberately left vague, McMahon injecting enough ambiguity into the language to give Britain room to maneuver later. But to Hussein the message was clear. Fight the Ottomans for us, and you will get your kingdom. A unified Arab state stretching from Aleppo in the north to Aden in the south, from the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf. It was the dream of Arab nationalism made flesh, guaranteed by the mightiest empire on earth, and Hussein believed it on the 10th of June, 1916, just weeks after the Sykes-Picot Agreement was formally ratified. Sharif Hussein fired a symbolic shot from his palace window toward the Ottoman garrison in Mecca, officially launching the Great Arab Revolt. His sons, the Emirs Ali, Abdullah, and Faisal, led Bedouin tribesmen battle against Ottoman forces across the Hijaz, the western coast of Arabia. The fighting was fierce and fought and desperate. The Ottomans held Medina with a formidable garrison under the command of Fakhri Pasha, and the initial Arab attacks on the city were repulsed. But with British gold, weapons, and military advisors flowing in, the revolt gained momentum. The Red Sea ports of Jeddah, Yanbu, and Rabigh fell to the rebels, and into this volatile mix stepped one of the most romanticized figures in modern history, Captain T.E. Lawrence. Lawrence was a young British intelligence officer who spoke fluent Arabic and had spent years working as an archaeologist in Syria before the war. He was sent to the Hejaz to assess the revolt, and quickly identified Faisal, Hussein's third son, as the charismatic leader the movement needed. Lawrence and Faisal formed a partnership that would become the stuff of legend. Together, they waged a brilliant guerrilla campaign against the Ottoman forces, sabotaging the Hejaz railway, tying down tens of thousands of Turkish troops, and eventually leading the Arab forces in a dramatic overland march to capture the strategic port of Aqaba in July of 1917. It was a stunning military achievement, and it transformed the Arab revolt from a regional nuisance into a strategically significant campaign. But Lawrence knew something that Faisal did not. He knew about the Sykes-Picot Agreement. He had discovered it during his intelligence work, and the knowledge tormented him. He was encouraging Arab leaders to fight and die for a promise of independence that his own government had already secretly betrayed. Years later, Lawrence would write about this with agonizing honesty. He described himself as a man caught between the orders of his government and the promises he had made to his Arab allies, a man who had built a house on lies. Настоящая цель империи была далека от обещаний свободы, и когда в 1917 году секрет наконец всплыл наружу, этот взрыв потряс не только пустыни Востока, но и весь мировой порядок. In November of 1917, the Russian Revolution upended everything. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky, seized power in Petrograd and immediately set about dismantling the old Tsarist order. One of their first acts was to open the archives of the Russian Foreign Ministry and begin publishing every secret treaty they could find. On the 23rd of November 1917, Trotsky published the full text of the Sykes-Picot Agreement in Izvestia and Pravda. Lenin called it the Agreement of the Colonial Thieves. 3 days later, the Manchester Guardian reprinted the text in English and the secret was out. The reaction was immediate and devastating. In the Arab world, it confirmed every suspicion about European intentions. Sharif Hussein demanded an explanation, but British officials deceptively assured him it was merely a preliminary discussion. In Washington, President Woodrow Wilson was deeply embarrassed. The revelation directly contradicted his principle of self-determination, leading him to announce his 14th points in January of 1918, declaring an end to private international understandings at the very same time. The British government had made yet another promise. On the 2nd of November 1917, British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour sent a letter to Lord Walter Rothschild, known as the Balfour Declaration, favoring a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. 3 promises, 3 incompatible commitments to the Arabs, the French, and the Zionists, turning the Middle East into an intractable conflict zone. The war ended in 1918, and the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Faisal's Arab forces entered Damascus, setting up an administration. But the French, led by Picot as High Commissioner, asserted authority over the same territories. At the Paris Peace Conference of 1919, Faisal and Lawrence pleaded for independence, but the Allies simply repackaged the Sykes-Picot framework into the mandate system under the League of Nations. At the San Remo Conference in April of 1920, the final carve-up was formalized. France received Syria and Lebanon, Britain received Iraq and Palestine. In July of 1920, French General Henri Gouraud crushed a small Syrian army at the Battle of Maysalun, expelling Faisal from Damascus. France divided Syria into smaller sectarian statelets for the Alawites, Druze, and Sunnis to ensure no unified resistance could challenge its authority. The effects persist in modern Syria's civil war, which began in 2011. In Lebanon, the French expanded Mount Lebanon by annexing Muslim-majority areas, creating a precarious demographic balance and a confessional political system that eventually collapsed into a devastating civil war in 1975. Remaining a source of paralysis today, Britain improvised on a grand scale. At the Cairo Conference in 1921, Winston Churchill installed Faisal as king of Iraq, stitching together Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul despite their vastly different Shia, Sunni, and Kurdish populations. Holding this artificial state together required authoritarian force, culminating in the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein. Hussein's brother Abdullah was given Transjordan. Palestine descended into chaos as Jewish immigration accelerated. Resisting Arab populations led to cycles of violence. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the creation of Israel, and the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Mark Sykes died of the Spanish influenza on the 16th of February 1919 in Paris at the age of 39. In 2008, scientists exhumed his body from his ancestral home in Sledmere to study the virus. François-Georges Picot lived until 1951, dying in Paris at the age of 80 after witnessing the full unfolding of the mandates, the creation of Israel, and the Cold War. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 included provisions for a Kurdish state, but the Turkish War of Independence, led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, overturned it. The Replacement Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 made no mention of a Kurdish state, dividing 40 million Kurds among Turkey, Iraq, Syria, and Iran, leading to decades of conflict and Saddam Hussein's genocidal Anfal campaign in the late 1980s. Yet, these arbitrary borders have proven remarkably durable, surviving a century of coups, revolutions, and civil wars. Ruling elites benefit from them, armies defend them, and international bodies like the Arab League enshrine the inviolability of inherited colonial borders to avoid war's chaos. Scholars debate whether Sykes-Picot is the root cause of instability or a symbol for deeper problems, call Cold War geopolitics. Oil wealth or religious extremism. But Sykes-Picot matters because it established the original sin of the modern Middle East. The logic that European powers had the right to determine the political future of millions without their consent. When the Islamic State erased that border between Iraq and Syria in 2014, their message resonated because for millions. The Sykes-Picot Agreement is the reason their grandparents were denied self-determination and why their countries are shaped the way they are. Two men sat in a room in 1916, drew lines on a map, and 100 years later people are still dying along those lines. That is the power of a map drawn in secret. Если эта история открыла для вас новый взгляд на то, как формировался современный мир, поставьте лайк и подпишитесь на канал «Рассекречено. Секретные досье». Мы продолжим раскрывать тайны из архивов спецслужб, которые до сих пор определяют заголовки мировых новостей. До встречи в следующем выпуске.